Hello, everybody. It's Natalie here from Genealogy Stories. If you haven't met me before, I'm Natalie. I'm a family history addict, a history obsessive. I run a membership called Census Club, which is all about finding and writing your family history stories. And every fortnight, I pop on live with different experts to talk about history and genealogy. And today I'm joined by David from Ireland. And hi, David, would you mind introducing
Hi,
yourself?
Natalie. My name is David Ryan. I'm a professional genealogist and historian based in Cork City. And for those unfamiliar with Irish geography, we're down in the very south. So we're the biggest county in Ireland.
Okay,
And we
great.
also possibly have the biggest chip on our shoulder, according to the rest of the country.
So you're from the feisty part of Ireland, are you?
Well, for those who follow soccer, they're now no doubt familiar with Roy Keane. So Roy Keane is a proud Cork man. So
Okay, okay. And it's soccer that you follow rather than football.
well, yeah, I'm saying he's for soccer fanatics, they'd be very familiar with him,
Okay,
I
okay.
imagine.
You can see why I'm looking really blank here. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll take your word for it. So, David, I know that you are a professional genealogist, offering services helping people to discover their Irish ancestors. But how did you start tracing your family history and kind of what led you down that path?
I always loved history, and I have memories as a small child whenever we'd visit my paternal grandparents, there'd nearly always be somebody else stopping by. That was just the way it was in rural Ireland. You didn't ring someone up to check if they were in. You assumed they'd be there, and you stopped by. That was it was there'll always be somebody else there who was a distant relation. And there'd always be that curiosity of, okay, how are we related to these people? That would be the same with my mother's side of the family, because they lived fairly close by. And I have another memory of coming across this one of these fancy coat of arms surname histories
Yeah,
that you can pick up at all the tourist
yeah,
shops.
yeah.
And it had this whole thing about how the Ryans were kings of Tipperary or something like that. I remember thinking, oh wow, I'm descended from royalty. I'm feeling quite proud of myself until I actually began, researching, well, what did medieval kingship in Ireland mean? And, being king of an area it's like being, the mayor of a small town versus the mayor of London. In theory, it's the same title, but in reality, not quite the same level of power. So,
Sure, I get what you mean. Oh,
didn't necessarily mean that they were all that important in the grand scheme of things.
yeah.
But, for a brief while, it gave me a bit of an ego boost.
I wonder how many families have those scrolls, because my grandparents have got one for Pithers with a coat of arms, and it basically says that eventually we track back to Peters. And I do a one name study, and I've actually find it it's very rare that my surname's confused with Peters, so I'm not convinced by that argument at all. And
Yeah,
yeah, and I
that
wonder,
is
but
part of the
you
problem
know,
with surname
but it's
research,
it's
isn't it?
framed and put up on the wall,
Yeah, so
and it piqued my interest as a child. I found it fascinating, so it served its purpose, I suppose, and it helped. Was yet
oh,
another thing that
definitely,
makes you
yeah,
interested in your family history. But
exactly. It's
yeah,
and so
it,
sometimes the fancy lies are just as good at at sparking that interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. The fancy lies. I like that.
Yeah,
That's a good term, actually. Fancy lies you have in your family history. I
yeah,
just wanted to. I said just before we went live, didn't I? Remind me because I'll forget and I had forgotten.
yes.
But
People
tell
can
everyone
comment.
who's watching, yeah, that you can comment and ask your questions, and I can pop them up on screen as we're going along. So please feel free to jump in and ask your questions whilst we're chatting. So you had this big Irish family.
Yeah, big enough. I mean, my dad has 6 siblings. My mom has only 3, but like as you go back in the generations, my grandparents all had a lot of siblings. Their parents would have had a lot of siblings. So like a lot of Irish families, once you start going back, typically you do encounter just grows and grows and grows.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Oh, Daniel's just popping up to wave hello. We thought Daniel was another fantastic Irish genealogist, and we thought that he'd probably
Yes.
be popping in. So hi, Daniel. Okay, so what kind of things did you start discovering? Can you tell me about any of your favourite finds or your
um,
favourite ancestors?
there were a few. I suppose, I started doing some relatively recent research looking into my maternal grandfather because, like, I always remember him as being a very quiet man. Very like loved his grandchildren, always had great time for us. But he died when I was only about 9 years old, so I never got to an age where I could start asking him questions. And I remember, there'd always been, I've been aware that he had spent, he'd been locked up at one point.
Okay.
And I, only a few years ago, through one of my mom's cousins who was back from Australia, who'd done an interview with his father, who was my grandfather's brother, that he'd basically gotten his father's life story and that's not filled in some blanks, and I was able to go up to the National Archives in Dublin and find out some more information. So it was basically tied up with Irish politics in the 1940s and the fact that Ireland was officially neutral, but the Allied powers, particularly our neighbours in Britain and across the pond in the USA, weren't particularly happy with this decision to stay neutral. And there's always a fear on the part of the Irish government that, given any pretext that they would invade and just seize Ireland's resources for themselves,
Mm.
as a justification of sort of, oh well, we're in a war, we need your ports for our navy, we need all your other resources for our army. And at this time, some members of the IRA, which was a somewhat different organization than the one I think that most people would be familiar with nowadays from all the troubles in Northern Ireland. This was certainly not quite on the same scale, but some members did start wanted to start up a bombing campaign in various cities on sort of the idea that, well, look, while Britain is distracted with the war, this is a chance for us to sort of to make our point.
Hmm. Yeah, fight freedom.
Fight freedom, or whatever definition of freedom
Yeah, yeah, I'd say it
they
with
have.
yeah. I'll say it with
So the Irish government said, it's safer if we just we start locking up anyone who is a member of this group, regardless of their ideology, because there was a lot of, even though they all had the name of the IRA, there was a lot of different ideologies within it.
Mhm.
You had those who were, that's the best way to put it, I suppose, were kind of more traditional, who sort of, oh well, they're fathers or other relatives had been active during the Irish War of Independence in the 1920s. They saw us as carrying on that. And then you others who were much more left wing, who would have been sort of attracted to communist and socialist ideology,
Hmm.
and all of these different ideologies didn't always get along.
Sure.
So they all got shoved into an internment camp in the Curragh in County Kildare, which is for people interested in horse racing. That's there's a big race course there now. So it was fancy. It was very interesting for me reading up on that and sort of
Yeah.
learning about that he didn't. It wasn't necessarily that he'd done something wrong, that he was a terrorist or criminal. It was simply just that he was sort of on the wrong side of things as far as the government were concerned.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think with Irish history, and the kind of, especially the political side of Irish history, that you have to be kind of quite aware of areas of grey and kind of trying to
Most
interpret
definitely.
political pasts, not necessarily through modern eyes? Do you think that's fair to say? It's probably
I think
particularly
so, and in
important for
fact,
Irish history.
yeah, and in fact, at the moment, I'm reading a fantastic book called The Irish Assassins by a historian named Julie Kavanagh, and it's about the murders of two British officials in Dublin in 1882, and it came at a time when there was a lot of tension in Ireland over land ownership, and there was this political campaign for home rule for Ireland, and the murders almost led to this sort of complete breakdown. But you have these politicians who on the Irish side, and some of them were all publicly. They made a big thing of condemning the murders afterwards. That's part where some of their language we could look back at it and see it as very inflammatory.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny because I've just had a comment come through from Jane actually. So Jane is saying, I find Irish research challenging, but confess I haven't spent a lot of time on it yet. Four of my husband's 2 times great grandparents emigrated from Ireland: Clare, Tipperary, Wicklow, and Kildare. Yeah, we will touch on immigration a little bit actually. I am
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, being British. I've got my echo back. Sorry, hang on. So being British, can you still hear me? Okay. Okay. Yeah, being British. I didn't do anything, I don't think, or very, very little on the history of England and its relationship with Ireland and vice versa at school. So obviously I'm at an age where I do remember the Good Friday Agreement being signed, but my knowledge of Irish history is very weak and it's very little, and most of it comes from my ex-partner who's Northern Irish, and kind of his interpretation of things and explanations of things. Not He's not particularly political, but just kind of explaining things.
Yeah.
And he was always
It's
really gobsmacked about how little we did it at school, did anything at school. So I don't know how much that's changed over the generations. I wouldn't like to comment, but I'm just wondering if you are completely new to Irish history, especially sort of Irish 20th century history, but then also the implications further back of English landowning in Ireland. Where can you kind of start to kind of find your feet to kind of get to grips with
that
some of that
is
history? Do you think?
yeah, that's quite tricky.
Yeah.
I think a good starting point is with the Act of Union in 1801. Because
Okay.
what that meant is that the Irish Parliament was closed down, all the Irish MPs had to take their seats in Westminster, and any legislation from then on governing Ireland was passed in Westminster.
Okay.
And that has big implications then for genealogical records. Because, the sort of records that we have, say, for example, our civil registration is based on the civil registration system used in England and Wales. Our census schedule, for at least up until the establishment of the Irish Free State, was on the same schedule as England and Wales.
Okay. So I've always been told that Irish genealogy is harder than English history, not necessarily than Welsh history, because that has its own Welsh genealogy, because that has its
Oh,
own
yeah.
complications, as I'm well versed in with all my babies.
Yes.
But do you think that's true? Do you think Irish research is harder, or do you think it's just different? With different
I think it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Because obviously, a lot of material was lost when in the Public Record Office fire of 1922. So, in some cases, that does. If you're trying to fill in gaps, that for example, we have the missing census records. So we only have the only full census records we have which survive are 1901 and 1911. And then there are some fragments, like literally like only a few pages from some of the earlier census.
Okay.
And many, a lot of those were lost when the Public Record Office fire, and then others were simply pulped during World War One due to a paper shortage.
Okay.
So that does make it's harder. It means that you end up having to rely more on other records. You might not necessarily be able to track individuals with the same sort of precision that you can with UK and US records. You end up having to rely more and say, well, okay, I have the head of household here at this time. Now, can I find maybe some church records or the civil registration records for them?
Sure. And I mean, I suppose on the plus side, quite a lot of Irish genealogy records are online, freely available.
Oh, they are. Yeah, and that's, I think, something I think which catches people by surprise, because I know there was a lot of complaints about the upcoming release of the British census records, and the fact that they're going to, you'll have to pay a certain fee for each record, whereas in Ireland, a lot of our surviving records are freely available. Like, for example, with the civil registration, like I know in the UK you have free BMD.
Yep.
But that only gives you the index. If you want, like say if you're looking for, maybe you have a few individuals with the same name, born roughly the same time, you're going to have to order those records and spend money ordering those records from the GRO to get them. Whereas with Irish records, you have birth records up to 100 years, marriage records, I think, up to about 70, and then death records up to about 40 years. But you can actually, you can see those available for free.
Yeah, it makes a massive difference, especially if you are lucky and hit a slightly more unusual name. But yeah, no, that is one thing that I think people do forget about Irish genealogy, and also, like you said, that there are alternatives. So the records that you want might have been destroyed, but I'm sure I listened to a talk, and I'm sure I did it, but I could be lying. It could be a false memory. It could be that I heard the tip and haven't actually done it. But I'm sure I heard somebody say that dog licenses. People applying for licenses for owning a dog, which I think are on Find My Past.
Yep, they're on Find My Past.
Was a good alternative, and I'm sure I have looked at them. I think.
And then you can also find the court records for where someone was fined for not having a license. So
okay, that's really a useful tip.
Yeah. So
and what about newspapers? Are there lots of
newspapers? There is a great coverage. There a lot of stuff is available on the Irish Newspaper Archive. But then there are also some Irish newspapers which are available as part of the British Newspaper Archive.
Yeah. Okay, great.
So I'd say it definitely recommends a subscription to both sites if possible. And now is a very good time to do it because there are a lot of pre-Christmas sales. So
Yeah, I think there's a 50% off offer on at the moment for Irish
mm,
newspapers. I think. I
there
think.
is,
I
yeah.
haven't used them personally, so I can't comment.
Yeah,
But
but it is, it is a great resource, especially for later when you start to get obituaries in them, and even just for getting some context on local history.
okay, okay,
But I would warn though, when using Irish newspapers, be very aware that just like today, each newspaper had its own particular ideological slant. So you get some newspapers, even in Cork, that were predominantly, catering to Church of Ireland, Unionist, sort of very establishment, middle and upper class. And that has a big impact on the type of stories that you find in them.
yeah, no. So it's a really, really good tip actually. Going to normally in a newspaper, you can see who printed it and who published it, and actually going and having a look and googling who they were and what their affiliations were is really well worth doing, definitely. Um, and sometimes people also say that a bit like Welsh surnames, that Irish surnames can make it harder. Um, do you think that's true? And can you
Uh,
explain
yeah,
how Irish
it
surnames
is.
work?
It's with some surnames it can be. For example, my own surname of Ryan is one of the most common Irish surnames, but it is predominantly concentrated in the province of Munster, here in sort of the southwest corner of the country. But yeah, surnames. Occasionally you'll find some surnames are very concentrated on a specific county or a specific region,
Okay. So
and you
when
can
you're
use that for sort of trying to narrow it down a bit.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I think one of the most frustrating things that can happen is when you're doing your research certainly in England, Wales, and you find somebody on the census and it says birthplace Ireland,
Yeah,
and there's no narrowing down. You're like, oh, so then you're battling a potential hole in records plus no narrowed down place plus
yeah,
a very
it's
common surname, but it's a really good tip that actually just checking to see whether that surname has got certain local ties is really worth doing, because at least it's a starting point. It doesn't necessarily mean they're definitely from that area, but
oh yeah, but
it's
it
maybe
gives
maybe
yeah,
rather than looking at the whole of Ireland, maybe start there and then work your way out.
yeah, and there is
Yeah.
a great resource for names. The Irish genealogist John Grenham. On his website, he has a johngrenham.com. He has a fantastic surname search. So if you input the Irish surname, it brings you up a little map and shows you sort of the distribution of that surname in the mid 1800s.
Okay. Okay. Tantalizingly, I've got an ancestor who has got an Irish place name as a middle name, but I don't think
Mm.
they're Irish, which is really. I think they were British soldiers based in Ireland.
Okay,
Which is
yeah.
it's curious as to why this place, I can't remember what it is now. It begins with W.
Was this Waterford or?
Waterford. That's it. Yeah,
Yeah,
Waterford. Yeah, yeah. All I could think of was Westmoreland. I was like, it's definitely not Westmoreland. And then when you get something in your head, you're like, don't say that, and then
yeah.
it's all you can think of. Yeah, no, Waterford, which is curious. So yeah, it's always been a bit of a tantalising one. Um, talking about surnames and then like trying to, finding somebody that was just born Ireland and then trying to trace back. Um, Obviously, immigration's quite an important part of
Oh,
understanding
it's
Irish
yeah,
history and
definitely it's
genealogy as well.
invaluable. Yeah.
At a high level, what are some of the reasons why Ireland has quite a high level of immigration, certainly in the past?
Well, the famine in the 1840s was a major part of that. But it's also fact, even after the famine, Ireland remained quite poor. You had big families. There wasn't necessarily much in the way of inheritance prospects. because if you have a plot of land roughly the size of your back garden, and that's like your entire property, and you have to somehow support, say, a family of maybe 8 or 9 on that. And then, when it comes down to the inheritance, I mean, maybe 1 or 2 of them will get lucky. Maybe there's a family up the road with only daughters and they've no one to inherit, so they can get some land that way. But for the rest of them, then, emigration is the only real prospect. And, the idea being that, well, they can go off to England or the USA or Canada or Australia, New Zealand, pretty much anywhere else in the world that, where there's more land, there are better prospects, and then they can send some of that money home.
Yeah.
And, a great resource is, a lot of local archives will have copies of these letters that were sent home. And some of them can be, kind of, sometimes, say, one of your daughters goes off and, gets a job in New York, and you're constantly writing saying, oh, well, you're being sort of a bit passive aggressive in terms of, well, oh, well, thank you very much for the money you sent home last month. We just about got by on it. That's sort of, very Irish mammy sort of, I'm not saying you're not sending home enough money, but
I'm not saying it either.
Not saying, oh, your sister who's, and even who has, her own kids to look after in England. Oh, well, she sent home even more. So it's that sort of, you're pitching them against each other. So it was.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What a find. That's amazing. I love that. Do you think that history of, I appreciate it's probably a really difficult question to answer, but do you think that history of immigration is quite important to Irish culture?
I think it is. I think it is
families?
a major part of it, because without that Irish immigration, I don't think that you would have, the independent Ireland that exists today. Because for a lot of the big Irish political movements were funded by monies coming in from Irish Americans.
Okay.
So, that was a very big part of it.
And it's funny actually, because obviously I'm aware that there are Irish stereotypes, but it was only when I came to do the picture for our show, for our episode, and I was looking for something that I wanted. I like to have faces on my pictures for Twice Removed because I think they're more engaging. So I was looking for a face, and eventually I found the young lad with the Irish map on his face. But trying to look for a picture to put up Ireland was really difficult. There's lots of lovely countryside ones, but I thought, well, if you don't know Ireland, you wouldn't necessarily know it was, it's thinking. But lots and lots of people in pubs drinking, like big, lots and lots of big groups of people drinking, dressed in green, with shamrock hats on, and pictures of people playing fiddles and the music stuff.
Yeah.
And it kind of made me realize, actually, I took a step back and I was like, wow, I hadn't realized quite how ingrained those kind of stereotypes are into kind of wider culture, really. And I don't know whether that's maybe something to be aware of when you're researching your family history, to be kind of aware of stereotypes, like the stereotype that Irish is perhaps heavier drinkers, maybe, or more fun-loving, or more outgoing.
Yes,
like whether it could be quite dangerous, I suppose, to look at your own family history and kind of, especially if you haven't met anyone from Ireland, kind of then apply those stereotypes
definitely,
to the past or to your own family
yeah.
history. But,
And it also comes down to what we were saying about, those shades of grey. Because, for example, you have a lot of Irish people who served in the British Army in World War One. And for those sort of not familiar with Ireland, they might be quite shocked at this. They might be wondering, well, why were they so willing to enlist and put their lives at risk for Britain? Why weren't they staying in Ireland and fighting for independence? And you have to explain that, well, and it was a lot more complicated back then because there were so many incentives for young men to enlist in the British Army at that time. Like a big thing that was used in propaganda was, oh, look at poor Catholic Belgium being plundered by the Germans. And that's sort of,
Okay.
like, using that as instead of like, Irish people, are you going to, stand by and let your fellow, this country that you so much in common with, are you going to let this, let it suffer?
Yeah, and playing up on your faith as well,
Oh,
that you
yeah.
have like a
And then there
religious
was also a
duty
lot
to.
of appeals to masculinity and male chauvinism. Like one of my favorite recruiting posters that I've come across is this man and a woman standing in a field, and the woman is pointing to the horizon where you see flames and smoke, and little caption saying Belgium, and she's saying to the man, "Will you go or must I?" Sort of like, are you
Yeah,
manly
yeah.
enough to take up arms and fight this war, or must I sort of put you to shame and do it for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah,
there was
that's
all this
really
sort of
interesting.
stuff, this.
Yeah.
And of
And then
course,
I and
had
then I suppose if you thought it was a phony war as well, you thought it was going to be, they didn't know it was going to be a 4-year war
oh, they
with
didn't.
mud,
That's
with
it. Yeah, it was
high death
and
rates.
especially if you're a young man, maybe you're thinking, well, oh, my only prospects are to inherit the farm from my father, or I want something more out of life. I'll sign up in the army. I'll get a sense of adventure, and I'll come back with money from it. And I suppose as well there was also the women will flock to a man in uniform. So
Oh, we do. So um going back a step to when we were talking about immigration and we were talking about large families, does that I'm guessing that's got some benefits in that you have like all these people to explore,
oh,
and
definitely,
they're kind
yeah.
of still related to you, and you can go off down tangents. But how do you kind of manage, like, how personally do you manage keeping all these different people, especially when they have the same names? I know there's some of the naming traditions, Catholic naming traditions as well,
Yeah.
of using the same name as middle names, or the same name as a first name and a different middle name to distinguish people. How do you kind of keep track of all of those people in your head or on your software, or how do you kind of manage it?
Sometimes it can be quite tricky.
Yeah, I
I've
bet.
come across situations where you have, say, maybe there's like a Patrick Ryan born, say, 1850, and then there's another Patrick Ryan, seemingly to the same parents, born a few years later. And, like I'm scratching my head trying to figure, well, what's going on? And a lot of time, the only assumption I can make is, well, that, the first Patrick must have died. And then they said, oh, well, they'll, keep the name and use it for another child down the line. So sometimes it can be tricky, especially in the period before death records started appearing with the civil registration.
Mm,
Well, first, we don't have burial records in Ireland until 1864.
okay.
So that does sometimes can make it tricky. And I have run into that in, once I get back to say like, the early 1800s, where, I'm sorry, I'm looking for a marriage record, and I have two individuals with the same surname, the exact same name, living in the same townland, and two different, maybe they both married women of the same first name. And it's, quite tricky trying to figure out, well, okay, which one of these is the correct marriage for my ancestor?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely can get really, really tricky. Funnily enough, I have um a Martin Webster who no Irish connection, I don't think, but they are Catholic, so maybe if I go farther back, they might be. But he was born, according to Census, he was born in 1818 to Susanna and Martin, and goes on and gets married and has children and things. But the problem is, I've also found a baptism for a Martin Webster. Martin's an unusual first name in this period. Martin Webster, baptized in 1818, and a death 3 years later. So I'm like, so did the same family have two Martins? And
Yeah.
my 1818 one actually wasn't born in 1818, but somehow was picked up that year and has carried it on. Or are there two families with called Martin and Susanna both having Martins? But that seems kind of unlikely. I've not really found another
Mm.
Martin and Susanna together in Bethnal Green in London. But yeah, it's yeah. So I can relate, is what I'm saying. But yeah,
Yes.
it becomes really tricky. And
Yeah.
I've certainly come across families where they've got like you say, two Johns, and the only thing that I can think of is that one of the children was ill and they thought, oh, that child might die, so we're going to name our next child John. But then the original John, got better and survived, and they ended up with two
Yeah.
children called John, which must have been so confusing. They must have had nicknames,
I
and I'd
suppose
love
that's
to know
why.
what they are.
Yeah, I suppose that's also why middle names were so important.
Yeah, yeah. As a child, I desperately wanted a middle name. I don't have one, so I've made up for it with all my kids. But yeah, I think middle names, especially in Irish genealogy or more Catholic families, can be quite important actually. Um, yeah, I'm sure I found a whole family once where all the daughters had the same first name, like four or five of them,
Oh
but they
my
were all
god.
like, but all like Mary Therese, Mary. I'm trying to think of another kind of quite common Catholic name, but
Yeah.
yeah, but they were obviously all went by their middle names, but officially their first names are all the same. So yeah, I've just noticed we're just over halfway, so I just wanted to remind anyone, if you do have any questions or comments, then please feel free to jump in and interrupt my rambling, because I'll as I do, as I think of things. So, what are some of your favourite Irish resources, do you think?
Oh, well, obviously, the census records are fantastic, particularly once you get to 1911 and they really start to record so much more detail. When they actually start to tell you the what types of illnesses people had, how many children had been born, how many were still living. All these sorts of details are so important, and the way our census website is set up on the National Archives, you can actually just say, okay, let me do a random search, like say, how many blind blacksmiths were there living in, such a county in 1911, or
Okay.
something else completely
Yeah.
random, which I think can be quite useful for anyone doing a one place study.
Yeah,
Learning
absolutely.
more about, okay, how many people of such an occupation did we have in the town at this time? And
Yeah, actually, even if you found your own ancestor was something like a blacksmith, trying to find out, like, was he the only blacksmith in the town, or did he have competition, and how did that affect his work? So yeah, I could see lots of
yeah,
ways that could be really, really useful and interesting when especially when you're starting to write up your stories and kind of think of that context. So um, and another thing that I was thinking about as well, as I was getting ready to chat to you, was about and I was looking through the pictures for the image, is how beautiful Ireland is, and all the different landscapes. And I kind of wondered how much you think that's kind of shaped the lives of Irish people in the past, especially when you were working on the land more.
I
Um,
think it is. I think it is very um, important because certain areas are very fertile. Like, for example, the area where my own ancestors are from is referred to as the Golden Vale, because it has like the grass is so good for dairy, for raising cattle.
okay.
Then you have other areas like, say, the Burren in County Clare, which is much rockier. The soil isn't quite as good for that. So I think that certainly has had a major impact on the lives of our ancestors, especially when there's, say, a famine of some sort, because typically those living in the west of Ireland, because the quality of the land wasn't as good, and they were relying much more on subsistence farming to survive, that they were sort of hit hardest by these disasters.
If you if you manage to trace your family back to that 1840s, can you pretty much guarantee that they would have been affected by that famine just by sheer numbers, or certainly if they were, if they weren't wealthy, as long as they weren't wealthy? Is it kind of, because I was trying to, I think it was Tara, Miss Friglin, was trying to explain to me the scale of the famine, and I think that's something that maybe people don't always understand.
Yeah, because I suppose we're so used to like sort of just seeing the statistics that like, oh, you had a population of 8 million that was, through death and immigration was essentially halved. But it was because it wasn't just about the potato crop failing, that it had massive economic repercussions as well. Because even if you're a relatively well off landlord, most landlords at that time were actually severely in debt. They were surviving on credit. Like a lot, which I think we saw with the financial crash a few years ago. That often those who present themselves as being really wealthy and sort of living it up, you find that they're maybe they don't actually necessarily have that much money in hand.
Yeah, they just have a really good credit.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that makes a big difference. And then this something like the famine hits, your tenants can't afford to pay their rent because they can't feed themselves, they can't, they don't have the energy to work, and then suddenly you find yourself in this. And I know from my own ancestors that the landlords that they were renting from, the Earls of Kingston, that even though there wasn't a huge death toll from the famine in the area compared to other areas, economically it still had a major impact because those landlords, they actually had to sell off most of their estates.
Yeah, I think it then becomes really interesting as well when you go back to immigration, about looking at who decided to stay as well. Because I think sometimes we can get quite excited about our immigrant ancestors, and imagine what it was like to leave home and go live somewhere new and have to start up. And I completely understand that. They should definitely be celebrated. But I think not at the price necessarily of thinking about those people that had to make that hard decision not to go or to stay home, and how what that was like to see other people leave. I always think that
Yeah, I think sometimes there was
melancholy.
I think sometimes there was even a degree of bitterness.
Okay, that's
That sort
interesting.
of thing that look, Jack is off over there in London or New York or Boston, that he seems to be, he's making in tons of money, he seems to be living it up, everything seems to be going great for him, and then I'm here sort of having to to feed my family and mind the farm and do all this stuff. And it's sort of that thing, isn't this, isn't it grand for the likes of them?
Okay.
Again, you said that sort of,
Yeah,
that's passive aggressiveness, which seems to be a theme with Irish families. That's really, that's, so you did get that. I like, like those immigrants, they were probably struggling quite a bit as well. Some
yeah.
of them, like I have heard stories of those, like they'd come back maybe once or twice a year, and they'd dress up first, like they might have this one good suit which they never wore, but they'd wear it just for that, and they'd be making a big thing that making out how great their lives were. But then when they went back, they're probably living in like a tiny apartment or tenement. Maybe they were like working 12-hour days in a factory. Maybe their lives weren't necessarily all that great
Mm.
either.
I don't.
But
Maybe
you sort of just had you had to keep up that that pretense.
Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe that's again why some of the Irish traditions are so like ingrained, into the stereotype of what an Irish person is like. But I'm thinking about things like music and
Mm.
folklore and those kind of richer cultural things. And I think maybe actually leaving somewhere makes those stronger, because you want
Oh, it
to
does. Yeah,
you
and
want to
you
take them
do.
with you and remember them.
Yeah, and like you do see that in a lot of
Yeah.
immigrant populations. That's, somebody like, say, the Irish in London or New York are probably more Irish in
Than
terms of,
Irish.
keeping up like sort of like, the traditions than those of us
Yeah, and
living here.
I guess when you go back home, though, it gives you something in common again, doesn't it? If you've gone off and, if you ever got to go home, because obviously some of our ancestors never got to go home. Once they'd left, they'd left. But if you're looking at kind of later migration,
Mm.
if you did maybe get to go home once or twice, when you did get home, your life would have been so different to the people that you'd originally left. But having that connection of shared stories and shared music and a shared cultural identity could kind of maybe bridge that, maybe.
Oh
Um,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's
James just said many who
oh
travelled to
yeah.
Australia and on to New Zealand were in mining communities and the like with high child mortality. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Jay.
Oh, it is very, yeah, and that's also something to keep in mind, when you're looking into immigration. Sort of like, why were they? What sort of jobs were they emigrating to?
Yeah, absolutely. I always think with a lot of our ancestors, it was like, oh no, the devil in the deep blue sea, isn't it? They kind of
Yeah,
out of the frying pan and into the fire so often because there weren't the choices. And I think sometimes maybe, especially when you're first starting out, I think maybe sometimes you can forget that. You can kind of think, oh, why am I not just bored? Why didn't they do X? And then you kind of think, well, because they couldn't, because they had no social security and they had no medicine and they did have medicine.
yeah,
They had no penicillin and they didn't have a national health service
yeah. And I mean,
or even a
if you
paid
wanted to,
system.
yeah, like if
Um,
you wanted to, like for medicine, you might be relying on, it's like, the local midwife for a lot of it, because like being able to actually get a doctor in would be so expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something kind of no matter where your ancestor was from, that to a certain degree, that's universal, isn't it? I think certainly in Western cultures. Um,
Mm.
okay, so I'm conscious that we've got only 10 minutes left, so I wanted maybe I should just ask, if you could kind of tell anybody anything about Irish history or Irish genealogy, what's the thing that makes you love it so much, or makes you so passionate about it? What would you
Um.
like to share if you could share anything? Yes, any story, or
um. Oh,
you can
that's
think. It's
always it.
okay. I can hum and
Yeah.
tune whilst you're talking to distract the viewers with my jazz
Well,
hands.
it's just, again, you find, those, when you find those local traditions. I think that's always fascinating because, like what you were saying about the culture. Because one of my favorite record sources is the National Folklore Collection. And as part of that, there is a schools collection. What this involved is, in the 1930s, school kids, usually about 9 or 10, they were given notebooks and they were told, go out, interview your parents, grandparents, neighbors, anyone in your area who has some stories of folklore. And, a lot of the time it's it'll be the usual folklore about buried treasure or ghost stories or something like that. But then on occasion you will get there will be, some nuggets of local history buried in that, because often you might say, oh well, there's a reference to a local field that was named after a certain family, and maybe that family emigrated, maybe they're all gone, but the name survives.
It's interesting how I Irish. You could say that Ireland's had quite a hard history in a lot of ways, and yet we associate like the luck of the Irish being lucky.
Yes.
And also, it's just thinking about, like, just completely thinking out loud, associating like the little people and fairy tales with, but fairy tales not as in kind of Disney fairy tales, but or
Oh,
Grimsworth fairy
definitely
tales,
not.
but kind of
No.
older fairy fae
Yeah.
tales, with Ireland. And I wonder. I don't expect
Yeah.
you to know the answer, but I just wondered why that is. It's
Well, I think a
interesting.
big part of it was the fact that, like electricity didn't come to rural areas until the 1930s and 1940s. And So that meant that before you had radios, television, storytelling was, that was how you kept entertained, and that was how you passed down those stories. But also, like, I found myself that from years ago, back when my grandmother was still alive, I remember I was staying up in, like, she'd moved down to a little house in the village, and my aunt had taken over the old family house. And I remember, staying in this, it's farmhouse. There is, nearest neighbors are like a mile up the road. And suddenly, when you're surrounded by pitch blackness, and no matter how rational you think you are, you suddenly find yourself, jumpy in nearly every sound.
Okay.
Like, maybe
Yeah, I
like
can
you
imagine
hear,
that.
like,
Yeah.
a fox, out in the distance, or even, with the dog start barking at something, and all of our, rationality, this, we're sitting here now, we're chatting away on Zoom, we're surrounded by lots of light, and, if someone told you there was a ghost in the house, you just, you'd laugh it off. You wouldn't think anything of it. But if all the power in your area suddenly went, and you were sitting there in pitch blackness, you would find it suddenly very easy to believe in pretty much anything.
No, I agree. I think you're quite right. I think there is something about maybe being more isolated or being
Yeah,
in quite fantastic landscape as well.
yeah. But I
That
also
kind
think
of
part of it,
makes the imagination go.
definitely. I think part of it as well is that our ancestors were, life to them would have seemed quite random, because we say, they didn't have access to much in the way of healthcare, didn't have anything in the way of social security, and one bad harvest could lead to ruin.
Mm.
And in that sense, it's, you need to be able to believe in something that you feel will give you luck. And it's something I've come across in a lot of oral histories as well, that there was almost a belief that luck could be transferred, that there was sort of, a finite amount of it in the world. And say that, if you win the lottery tomorrow, I'll be thinking, oh God, your neighbors might be almost expecting like their house to collapse or something.
Okay, because you've had your lot in life.
Yeah, basically, oh God, Natalie has used up all the luck for
Oh,
today.
you're
We're all
jinxing
we're all doomed. The rest of
Yeah,
us are going
yeah,
to
yeah.
go bankrupt, or so. Was that? So I think it was just the fact that when life was so random, that you need, you can understand people being superstitious.
Oh yeah,
I said,
definitely.
and then when they emigrated, they brought those traditions and those superstitions with them
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
way of sort of keeping their culture alive.
Yeah, and you don't chance it, do you? I mean, I don't. I know it sounds daft, but I never cross anyone on the stairs because as a child, my mum always told me, "Don't cross on the stairs; it's bad luck." Or put shoes on the table, that kind of thing. There's kind of old wives' tales, and although I don't really believe in them, I still don't do them because you
Yeah,
just don't
it's
get a chance
just
to.
that's it. It's like,
It's
well,
ingrained.
I don't necessarily believe in it, but am I going to risk it?
Doesn't do any harm not to do it. Yeah, no.
Yeah,
It's interesting that that a country that's quite famous for its religion, for its faith, in its Catholic faith in particular, I'm thinking of, although I know not all Irish people are Catholic,
yeah.
of course. Um, and there's obviously strong Protestant faith as well, and lots of other faiths, I'm sure, in a
Mhm.
multicultural
Oh,
society.
definitely,
So,
yes.
but just it's interesting that a place that is quite well known for that is also quite known for being associated with like things like fairies and superstition and the little people. It's a
Yeah, it
really
is.
interesting kind of mix.
It
Um,
is. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much, David. I
You're
just
welcome.
hang on for a moment in case anyone has any final
Sure.
questions. I can see there's sort of quite a few people watching actually. So please, if you do want to comment with a final question, then feel free. All the resources that David's kindly mentioned in this interview, I will pop into accompanying blog post, which I will share once
Yep.
it's
And
up
we
and
should
running.
also just, because I promised to give a quick promotion there for any of you who are on Twitter, followed the Ask Ireland account this week because our friend Claire Bradley, another fantastic genealogist based in Dublin, has taken over the account this week to tell you all about Irish genealogy.
Oh, that's a really good tip. Thank you. Um, yeah, Twitter's a great tip. Full stop for
It
me,
is
actually, isn't
fantastic.
it? It's a really good community there. Yeah. So I'll put all those resources, including that Twitter link, onto a blog post and send it out. And David, where can people come and find you if they want to find out a bit more about you and your services, or
They
follow
can,
you on
they can
social media?
find me on my website, ryangenealogicalresearch.com. I also have I'll be giving a talk in a few weeks for the genealogy show, which is December 5th and 6th. And then I'm also talking as part of Roots Tech Connect, which is another free, which will be free and online again this year, which is in the spring. I think is it February or March? I can't remember exactly when, but
Yeah, sure.
there'll be no missing it. So
Okay. So if you want to get David's contact details and you want to be notified of when that blog post comes out and all future episodes of Twice Removed, pop over to www.genealogystories.co.uk and you can subscribe to my email list there. It says daily emails, and you are welcome to the daily
yes,
emails. They are golden tips, but if that is a little bit much for you on your very first couple of emails, there's a chance to kind of downgrade just to the weekly news, because I know some people prefer it that way. So that's
yeah.
www.genealogystories.co.uk. But thank you very much, David, for joining me. I
You're
really
welcome,
enjoyed it. It was really
Natalie.
lovely to chat to you. I'm going to do that thing where I hit the end broadcast button and then it takes 30-40 seconds and I'm sat here looking like lemons, but small price to pay for the joy of history chatting. Thank
It
you.
is definitely.